So now we can move on to working with forms, which is another way to add interactivity into our site. Now, we almost always need some sort of form to have our end user contact us. So I have a contact.html page. And we already have part of a form in here, so let's make sure that we can see what we need over in our insert panel. So I'm going to fold up my files and double click my insert, fold up my tag inspector, and there we go. So I'm going to choose forms. So the very first thing that we want to put on our page is an actual form tag. So if I take a look at my code, I see the form ID for that particular tag. When I select it here in my tag inspector, I see the properties for that. So I probably wouldn't want to leave it just at form 1. Maybe name it basically what it's for, contact. Now I have an area here for actions. My actions is very important. What we're basically going to be doing in Dreamweaver initially is just the look and feel of that form. Now you need something, even with an email, to make it work properly, to send that data where it needs to go. So I need a script of some sort. So either it's a CGI script or PHP, Perl script. There are several different ways, depending on your server, in getting that information from the form back to you the way you need it. So I have a method as well. So I've got a get and post method. Post is my typical method for sending that data. I can choose a target, and again, that's mostly for the old days when we had frames, and I can encrypt it. So for instance, here I can apply a multi-part form data or apply different types of encryption. So let's take a look at what else that we have here. So I have a text field. Now a text field is fairly simple. Let me make sure I'm actually selecting the text field. I want to give it a name. Now it's very important for our naming conventions here. We don't want to have a space anywhere or it's not going to work properly. So more than ever, this is very important. Now if you're working with a developer, make sure that your naming conventions is what the developer needs. Now I can also give it a character width and a maximum width. See that it's a property of a text field. Now this is something that I can target in CSS as well, even though we're not going to bother with this particular contact form. There is lots and lots of information on styling forms available. So I have a type. Is it going to be single line, multi-line, or a password? And I can also give it an initial value. Now is it going to be a disabled field, or is it going to be just read only? Now if I need something to be required, that requires more of a dynamic form, and that goes beyond this particular chapter. So I have a hidden field, and my hidden field stores information entered by a user, such as a name or an email address or viewing preference, and then use that data when the user next visits the site. So this is information that you're probably not going to come up with on your own. Again, when you're working with the developer, they'll tell you what needs to have a hidden field or not. Or depending on what script you're using, they will also tell you typically good instructions on exactly what is needed. So then I have a text area. My text area really isn't all that much different from my text field. So I have a text area here. So I have a character width and I have a number of lines, and you'll see that this is indeed multi-line instead of single. But it is a text field, and again, I can target that through CSS. Now I have a checkbox. Well, that's fairly simple. And if I put my cursor in here, and I'll hit my enter or return key, and if I click checkbox, I get this dialog that comes up for my accessibility. Now, we said in our preferences earlier that we wanted to make sure and have good accessibility for everything that we did, and this is one example. So I can give it an ID. So let's say that this is going to be, would you like to sign up for the newsletter? So my ID might be newsletter. And then for my label, I can actually put that sentence. And I can attach this label tag using a for attribute, which is also a little more accessible than just the label itself. And notice that my position is going to be either before or after the form item, and I can have a tab index. So this is going to be my third in line, then I can have this be my tab index of 3, again making it more accessible. So I click OK, and now I get that in my document, and if I select my label, I see my checkbox, and I need to put in a checked value for this, so I'll just put my checked value in as newsletter. Now we can choose an initial state, having it checked or not, and even though you can choose checked for initial state, it's not very nice to do so. Now I've got a checkbox group. So my group allows, basically, think about a multiple selection of something. So if I want this to be my snapshots site, I might give them several options, like are they interested in networking, speaking, presenting at workshops. I could give them a multiple choice, and then they would be able to check multiple options, but it's going to be a group. So when it goes back to my database, all the information will be a part of a group instead of individual things, and it would make more sense. So I have a radio button, and a radio button on its own really doesn't do that much. Really, the radio button group makes much more sense. So for instance, we have a which type of camera do you own, an SLR or digital, and if I didn't have this as part of its own group, that really wouldn't make any sense either, and they would be able to check each one individually. Now I only want them to be able to check one, so I'm using a radio button and a radio button group. So see, the radio button is called camera, and if I click on that one, that is also called camera, and I would have a separate checked value for each one. So then I've got a couple of menus here. So I've got a select menu and a jump menu. So for instance, if I put my cursor after this and choose my select menu, and I might have this be for what type of camera they own. So you'll notice again with my ID there is no spaces, and I don't know that I really feel like I need to put a label in here, and I will show you why. So I'll just say no label and OK for just a second. So in my property inspector, that's selected, that is going to be a list menu instead of just a regular menu, because I want to allow for multiple selections. Now I have to give it a height and then a list value, but I'm going to choose my list value first. And here's where I would start to add my items. So I could enter something like Nikon and Canon. Now the value may not be the same thing as the item name. If I were Baskin Robbins and I had my 31 flavors, for instance, I bet that Rocky Road probably isn't in their code actually Rocky Road. I'm sure it has some number value to it, so that's what would need to be sent back. Maybe it's just OL, etc. And I would kind of carry that on. If I wanted to put maybe an initially selected item here, I might say, what camera do you use? I don't need a capital C. And I will say what? That doesn't need a value, but I am going to go ahead and put that up above everything else. When I click OK, I can say what my height is. So maybe my height is 3. And now I can click on my initially selected value. I don't necessarily need a label. I could always put one with it. Or I can now give instructions since it is allowing multiple selections, telling them what key to hold down to add multiples. I also have a jump menu. Now my jump menu is going to really take me somewhere. So in the past, I've seen people use this as even a sitemap. So they've got a drop down and it will actually take you to that particular page. In the context of our site, I might have something for them to go to. Maybe I have a whole bunch of locations for my snapshots user group, and it could take them to that location. I have an image field, so instead of the way that my button actually looks, I can use an image field instead. So in a search bar, I could have it be a magnifying glass, for instance, and have that be my go button. My file field allows me to browse for a file. Now, before you add something like this in, make sure you check with your host. So whoever's hosting it, whatever server that's going to be on, a lot of people won't even allow this strictly because it's a little bit of a security risk. So depends on what you're asking them to upload. Is it images? Is it resumes, for instance? So you want to check with your host first and make sure that they will allow that particular field. And I've got my regular button. So for instance, down here, I could regular button at the end. And when I click on button, I can give it an ID. So there's my submit. This doesn't need a label, and I actually wouldn't want to put one with it. So when I have it selected, I have my actual value. So whatever I put in here then ends up being as a part of my button. Of course, I also have another type of action for that button, and I could reset instead of submit that button. So I can add a label if I hadn't put one in there before, and I also have a field set. So take a look at the little icon for the field set. I love using field sets around a form so that I can then style it with CSS. So I can put the name of the form above it, so it's my contact form. Really, it makes it more accessible, and it lets me style the entire form area a lot easier with CSS. Now I do have some spry elements in here for something a little more dynamic. So I have my passwords and select and radio groups for spry as well. So those are the basics of putting your form fields into your page.